The chapel was quiet, save for the soft rustling of fabric as mourners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the polished wooden floor. The air was heavy with sorrow, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone present. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like even breathing too loudly would be disrespectful. At the center of it all sat an ornate coffin, its surface gleaming under the dim light. Flowers surrounded it, roses, lilies, and daisies arranged, carefully by friends who had loved Emily Carter deeply. She wasn't just anyone. She was a schoolteacher known for her kindness, patience, and unwavering dedication to her students. Her sudden death had left the small town reeling, unable to comprehend how someone so vibrant could vanish so abruptly. Daniel, Emily's husband, sat at the front row, his face pale and drawn. His hands rested limply on his knees, fingers twitching, occasionally as though trying to grasp something intangible. He hadn't shed a tear since the moment he received the news about Emily's passing. People whispered among themselves, saying it was shock or denial holding him together. They didn't know what else to think because grief manifests differently for everyone. Behind him sat Emily's sister Laura, clutching a tissue tightly in one hand while dabbing at her eyes with the other. She looked angry, not the kind of anger born out of hatred, but the raw, unfiltered fury that comes when life feels unjust. Her lips moved silently as if praying, though no words escaped them. Nearby, Emily's closest friends exchanged glances, none daring to speak aloud what they were all thinking. This didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. The pastor stood behind the pulpit, adjusting his glasses nervously before clearing his throat. He glanced at Daniel briefly, then scanned the room. "We gather here today," he began, his voice steady despite the heaviness in the air, "to honor the memory of Emily Carter, a woman whose warmth touched countless lives." As he spoke, memories flooded back to those gathered. They remembered her laughter echoing through the halls of the elementary school where she taught, her gentle encouragement when a child struggled with math problems, and the way she always seemed to know exactly what to say during difficult times. She was more than a teacher. She was a beacon of hope for many, but amidst these reflections there was also an unsettling undertone. No one could quite shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. Perhaps it was the abruptness of her illness, a fever that spiraled out of control within hours, or maybe it was the fact that none of them had seen her body after she passed. Whatever it was, doubt lingered like a shadow over the proceedings. Laura leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes as she stared at the closed coffin. Something nagged at the edges of her mind, though she couldn't quite place it. Was it guilt, anger, or simply disbelief? She shook her head imperceptibly, willing herself to focus on the pastor's words instead. And so, the pastor continued, pausing for effect, "We commend her soul to God, trusting that she is now at peace." Just as he finished speaking, a sound cut through the stillness, a faint knock. At first it was barely audible, almost blending into the ambient noises of the chapel. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps, unmistakable in their rhythm. The entire congregation froze, every eye turning toward the source of the noise. For a brief moment nobody moved. Then murmurs erupted, low and uncertain at first, growing louder as panic set in. Someone gasped audibly, and another person clutched, their chest as if struck. Daniel bolted upright from his seat, his face drained of color. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. It sounded like it came from inside the coffin," stammered a man seated near the back, his wide eyes fixed on the casket. Impossible, everyone thought simultaneously. Yet the truth stared them in the face, undeniable and terrifying. Could it really be? "Open it!" Daniel shouted, breaking the spell that held everyone paralyzed. His tone brooked no argument, and the pallbearers scrambled to obey, their movements frantic yet hesitant. What if they opened it only to find what they feared most? What if they didn't? As the lid creaked open, revealing what lay beneath, the world seemed to stop spinning. Time itself froze, leaving everyone suspended in a moment of sheer disbelief. And in that instant, Nothing would ever be the same again. The faint knocking sound echoed through the chapel once more, louder this time, sending a shiver down everyone's spine. It wasn't the wind or a loose board creaking. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and unmistakably coming from inside the coffin. The room fell silent except for the collective gasps of disbelief. People exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces frozen in shock. Was this some cruel joke? A trick of the mind brought on by grief? Or was it something far more extraordinary? Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his hands trembling as he stared at the coffin. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. For a moment he looked like a man caught between two realities, one where his wife lay lifeless before him, and another where the impossible had just happened. Behind him, Laura gripped her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her lips moved silently, forming words no one could hear as tears streamed down her cheeks. What is that?" someone whispered hoarsely from the back of the chapel. No one answered. Instead, all eyes remained fixed on the gleaming wooden box at the center of the room. Another knock reverberated through the air. 3 sharp taps, each, one louder than the last. This time there was no mistaking it. Whatever or whoever was making the noise was alive. "Open it." Daniel finally shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. He lunged forward, his hands reaching instinctively for the lid of the coffin. But before he could touch it, several men stepped forward. The pallbearers who had carried the casket earlier. They hesitated, exchanging uneasy looks. None of them wanted to be the first to break the seal, fearing what they might find inside. "It's not possible," muttered one of the pallbearers, shaking his head slowly. "She's gone. We saw her. We thought we saw her." Another corrected grimly, though his own voice betrayed uncertainty. Laura rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the edge of the pew for support. "Do something!" she cried, her voice breaking. "What are you waiting for?" Her plea seemed to snap the men into action. With trembling hands, they positioned themselves around the coffin. One of them placed his fingers under the lip of the lid while the others prepared to lift. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every breath felt labored, every heartbeat thunderous. As they pried the lid upward, a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The satin lining appeared undisturbed, pristine and untouched. Then movement, a faint twitch beneath the folds of fabric covering the body. Someone screamed, a high-pitched wail that shattered the fragile silence. Others recoiled, stumbling backward as if trying to escape the scene unfolding before them. And then, Emily's hand emerged, pale and trembling. It reached upward, brushing against the edge of the coffin as if seeking purchase. Her fingers curled, weakly, grasping at the air. The sight sent a wave of panic coursing through the congregation. Some people dropped to their knees, praying fervently, while others clung to one another, too stunned to speak. Daniel staggered closer, his face contorted with disbelief and horror. "Emily?" he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing glassy, unfocused eyes. For a moment she simply stared blankly at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Then slowly, painfully, she turned her head toward the gathered mourners. Recognition dawned in her expression, followed by confusion, and then terror. "What? Where am I?" she rasped, her voice hoarse and barely audible. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. Her arms flailed weakly, and she let out a soft whimper of frustration and fear. Daniel rushed to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he murmured, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "You're okay now." But Emily didn't seem convinced. Her gaze darted wildly around the room, taking in the sea of pale, shocked faces staring back at her. "Why is everyone here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why am I in a box?" "No," one answered. How could they? None of them understood what was happening any better than she did. All they knew was that the woman they had believed dead mere moments ago was now very much alive, and clearly terrified. Paramedics arrived within minutes, summoned by frantic calls from those in attendance. They worked quickly but carefully, lifting Emily out of the coffin and laying her on a stretcher. She winced with every movement, her body stiff and unresponsive after hours spent immobile. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, she reached out weakly, grabbing Daniel's wrist. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frailty. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. "Please." "I won't," Daniel promised, though his voice cracked with emotion. He held her hand tightly as the paramedics wheeled her out of the chapel, past the stunned faces of friends and family. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Back inside, chaos erupted. People began talking all at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and speculation. Some insisted it was a miracle, proof of divine intervention. Others whispered about medical errors, questioning how such a grave mistake could have been made. A few even suggested darker possibilities, that Emily's supposed death had been staged, or worse, that foul play was involved. Laura sank back into her seat, her hands pressed against her temples as if trying to block out the noise. She couldn't process what she had just witnessed. One moment she had been mourning the loss of her sister. The next she was watching her come back to life right before her eyes. It was too much to comprehend. As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered outside the chapel, unwilling to leave until they had answers. Reporters descended upon the scene almost immediately, drawn by the buzz of rumors spreading like wildfire. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into bewildered faces, and questions flew thick and fast. Yet no one could provide clarity. Not the pastor, not the doctors, and certainly not Daniel, who had vanished along with Emily. For days afterward, the story dominated conversations everywhere. Neighbors speculated over coffee, strangers debated on social media, and local news outlets scrambled to piece together the truth. But amidst all the noise and conjecture, one thing remained certain. Emily Carter's return from the brink of death had left an indelible mark on everyone who bore witness to it. And though the full story had yet to unfold, one question lingered in everyone's minds. How could someone declared dead awaken hours later, seemingly unharmed but forever changed? The hospital corridor buzzed with an energy that felt both frantic and surreal. Nurses hurried past, their shoes squeaking against the tiled floor, while doctors exchanged hushed whispers behind closed doors. Outside Emily's room, a small crowd had gathered. Family members, close friends, and even curious onlookers who had followed the story from the chapel. The air was thick with tension, a mix of relief, disbelief, and lingering fear. No one quite knew how to process what had happened, least of all Emily herself. Inside the room, Emily lay on the bed, her face pale but alive. Machines beeped steadily around her, monitoring her heart rate, oxygen levels, and other vital signs. An IV drip fed fluids into her arm, and a thin blanket covered her frail body. Her eyes were half open, darting between the people in the room, as if trying to make sense of their presence. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, his knuckles white from the effort. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, relief, guilt, confusion, all battling for dominance. "Emily," he said softly, leaning closer, so only she could hear him. "Can you tell us what happened? Do you remember anything?" She blinked slowly, her gaze distant. For a long moment she didn't respond. Then in a voice barely louder than a whisper she began to speak. I don't know," she admitted, her words faltering. "It's all so blurry. I remember feeling sick. Really sick. And then darkness. Just nothing." Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard, wincing as though the memory itself caused her pain. "But I wasn't gone," she continued after a pause. "I could hear things, voices, people talking about me, saying I was—" She hesitated, unable to finish the sentence. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, his own eyes glistening. "You're here now?" he said, his voice trembling. "That's all that matters." But Emily shook her head weakly. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't like being asleep. I was trapped. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. But I could feel everything. It was like I was buried alive." Her voice broke on the last words and she turned her head away, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, stepped forward. He had been observing quietly from the corner, letting Emily recount her experience in her own time. Now he cleared his throat softly to get everyone's attention. "What Emily is describing," he began, choosing his words carefully, "is consistent with a rare condition known as pseudo-death. It occurs when the body enters a state of extreme metabolic slowdown mimicking death. Vital signs become so faint that even experienced medical professionals can misinterpret them." He paused, glancing at Emily before continuing. "In cases like this, patients often report vivid sensations of awareness despite appearing unresponsive. They may perceive sounds, conversations, or even touch, but they are physically incapable of responding." Laura, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped forward abruptly. "So you're saying this was just some freak medical anomaly?" she demanded, her tone sharp with frustration. "How does something like that even happen?" The doctor nodded sympathetically. "It's incredibly rare but not unheard of. Stress, illness, or certain medications can trigger it. In Emily's case, we'll need to run further tests to determine exactly what caused her body to shut down so completely." Emily listened silently, her expression unreadable. When the doctor finished speaking, she turned her head slightly toward him. "Am I going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he assured her firmly. "Physically, you appear to be recovering well, but emotionally and mentally, this experience will likely take its toll. You've been through something profoundly traumatic, and it's important to give yourself time to heal." As the doctor spoke, Daniel glanced at Emily, his brow furrowed with concern. He wanted to believe everything would be fine, that they could put this nightmare behind them and move on, but deep down he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still off. Why hadn't anyone caught the signs sooner? And why had Emily suddenly regained consciousness just as her coffin was sealed? Later that evening, after most of the visitors had left, Daniel stayed by Emily's side. The room grew quiet except for the steady beeping of the machines. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, but neither could sleep. Emily stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that dark, suffocating void, trapped inside her own body. It was a sensation she knew would haunt her for a long time. "You should go home," Emily murmured finally, breaking the silence. "Get some rest." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "Not again?" His words hung in the air, between them heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily looked at him, searching his face for answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. What had he thought during those hours when he believed she was dead? Had he mourned her? Or had he felt something else entirely? "I'm scared," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking. "I don't understand what happened to me, and I'm afraid it might happen again." Daniel reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I'll make sure you're safe." But even as he spoke, doubt lingered in his mind. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, a dependable partner. Yet now, faced with this inexplicable turn of events, he couldn't help but wonder if he had failed her somehow. Had he missed warning signs? Ignored red flags? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving him no peace. Outside the hospital, reporters continued to camp out, eager for updates on the unfolding drama. Headlines blared across newspapers and news channels. "Woman wakes up in coffin after being declared dead." Speculation ran rampant, ranging from miracle stories to accusations of medical negligence. Some claimed it was divine intervention, proof of life beyond death. Others pointed fingers at the doctors, demanding accountability for the oversight. Back in Emily's hometown, reactions were equally divided. Friends and neighbors debated fervently, sharing theories and opinions over dinner tables and coffee shop counters. A few expressed skepticism, refusing to believe such a thing could happen without foul play. Others saw it as a sign, a reminder, of the fragility of life and the mysteries that still eluded human understanding. For Emily, however, none of that mattered. All she wanted was to feel normal again, to escape the suffocating grip of fear that clung to her like a second skin. As she drifted into a restless sleep that night, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the faint glow of fluorescent lights, one thought kept replaying in her mind. Why me? And somewhere deep within, another question lingered, darker and more unsettling. Who else knows the truth? Days turned into weeks, and Emily's recovery became a delicate balancing act between physical healing and emotional survival. The doctors had explained her condition, pseudo-death, as thoroughly as they could, but no amount of medical jargon could erase the trauma she carried within her. Every night she lay awake in her hospital bed, staring at the shadows cast by the dim light above her head. Her mind replayed the moments she couldn't escape, the suffocating darkness, the muffled voices, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. It was like living through it all over again. Except this time, she knew there was no coffin to trap her. Yet the memories felt just as real. During the day, Emily tried to focus on small victories. She could sit up now without assistance, though. Even that simple movement left her exhausted. Eating solid food was still difficult. The taste seemed foreign, almost nauseating, as if her body had forgotten how to process anything beyond IV fluids. But she forced herself to take tiny bites, chewing slowly, determined to regain strength. Each step forward felt monumental, yet each step also reminded her of how far she still had to go. Daniel visited daily, bringing books and updates from their home. He tried to keep conversations light, sharing stories about their garden or funny things their neighbors had said. But Emily noticed the cracks in his facade. His smiles never reached his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly whenever he handed her a cup of water. Something weighed heavily on him, something he wasn't saying. And while part of her wanted to confront him, another part feared what she might uncover. One afternoon, during one of these visits, Emily decided to push further. "Tell me everything," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the hospital room. Daniel looked up from the magazine he'd been pretending to read, startled by the intensity in her tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, cautiously setting the magazine aside. "I mean, tell me what happened before I woke up, before the funeral." Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "I need to know." Daniel hesitated, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he looked like he might deflect the question, change the subject, or offer some vague reassurance. But then he sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "Okay," he said finally, "but I don't know if you're ready for this." Emily nodded firmly. "Try me." He began slowly, piecing together the events leading up to her supposed death. She had fallen ill suddenly, a high fever, chills, confusion, and despite rushing her to the hospital, the doctors found nothing conclusive. Tests came back inconclusive, treatments didn't work, and within hours her vital signs plummeted. When she stopped responding altogether, they declared her dead. Daniel recounted the agony of those hours, describing how he sat beside her lifeless form, holding her hand until they took her away. "They said it was sepsis." Daniel continued, his voice growing quieter. "That your body shut down too quickly for them to intervene. I believed them. I trusted them." Emily listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. As he spoke, fragments of memory flickered in her mind. She remembered lying in bed, burning hot and shivering cold at the same time. She remembered hearing Daniel's voice pleading with her to hold on. And then, nothing. Just silence. But why didn't anyone check again? She pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why didn't they wait longer? Daniel shook his head, guilt etched across his face. They said it happens sometimes, that bodies can trick even the best equipment. I didn't question it. I should have, but I didn't. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. Emily stared at him, torn between anger and understanding. How could he not have known? How could anyone? Still, the thought of being abandoned in that state, of being sealed inside a coffin while still alive, was almost too much to bear. As the days passed, Emily began to piece together more of her experience. During therapy sessions with a counselor recommended by the hospital, she opened up about the sensations she remembered. The crushing weight of the satin lining pressing against her skin, the distant echo of voices discussing plans for her funeral, the unbearable feeling of isolation, knowing she was alive but unable to communicate. It's like my body betrayed me, she confessed during one session, tears streaming down her face. Even now I can't trust it. What if it happens again? The counselor nodded sympathetically, jotting notes on her clipboard. What you've been through is incredibly rare, but it's also profoundly traumatic. It's normal to feel anxious or afraid. The key is learning coping mechanisms to ground yourself when those fears resurface. Grounding techniques helped, but only to a point. Emily found herself avoiding mirrors, terrified of seeing the reflection of someone who had, technically, died. She flinched at loud noises, convinced they were echoes of the coffin lid closing. Even sleeping became a challenge. Every dream felt like a descent back into that dark void. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, speculation continued to swirl. Reporters dug deeper into Emily's case, interviewing doctors, family members, and acquaintances. Some claimed her survival was a miracle, proof of divine intervention. Others pointed fingers at the hospital staff, accusing them of negligence. A few even hinted at darker possibilities, rumors of foul play, whispered conspiracies that refused to die down. Laura, Emily's sister, became increasingly vocal in her criticism. During a particularly heated phone call with Daniel, she accused him of failing to advocate for Emily during her illness. "You should have insisted on more tests," she snapped, her voice sharp with accusation. "You should have made sure she was really gone before letting them put her in that box." Daniel bristled at the implication but said nothing. Instead, he hung up the phone and sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, eating away at whatever confidence he once had. He replayed every decision he'd made, questioning whether he could have done more to save Emily or prevent the nightmare entirely. Back at the hospital, Emily remained oblivious to the chaos brewing around her. Her world had narrowed to the four walls of her room, where she focused solely on surviving each new day. But even in her isolation, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was missing, something important. It wasn't until a routine blood test revealed an anomaly that the truth began to unravel. One evening, as Emily scrolled through old messages on her phone to distract herself, a nurse entered the room carrying a clipboard. "We got your latest lab results back," the nurse announced brightly. "Dr. Patel wants to discuss them with you tomorrow." Emily frowned. "Is something wrong?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the chart in her hands. "Not exactly, it's just unusual. There are traces of a sedative in your system, something we didn't expect to find." "A sedative?" Emily's stomach churned. "What kind of sedative?" "I'm sorry, I don't have all the details," the nurse replied apologetically. "But Dr. Patel will explain everything tomorrow." That night, sleep eluded Emily completely. Her mind raced with possibilities. Sedatives weren't uncommon in hospitals, but they were typically administered under controlled circumstances, with consent. Had someone given her medication without telling her? Or worse, had someone intentionally drugged her? When morning came, Dr. Patel arrived promptly, his expression grave. "Emily," he began, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "The substance we found in your bloodstream is a powerful drug often used in surgical procedures. In high doses, it can induce unconsciousness similar to what you experienced." Emily's heart pounded. "How did it get there?" That's what we're trying to determine, Dr. Patel admitted. It's possible it was administered accidentally or deliberately. Either way, it explains why your body entered such a deep state of shutdown. The implications hit Emily like a freight train. Someone had tampered with her health. Someone had caused her to slip into that coma-like state. But who? And why? Her thoughts immediately turned to Daniel. He had been with her throughout her illness, had access to her medications, and stood to gain financially from her death. Could he have done this? The idea seemed absurd, yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Overwhelmed, Emily asked Dr. Patel to leave so she could process the revelation alone. As she stared out the window, watching the sun rise over the city skyline, one thing became painfully clear. Her ordeal wasn't over. In fact, it might be just beginning. The revelation about the sedative in Emily's system sent shockwaves through her fragile world. What had started as a miraculous survival story now took on darker undertones, unraveling threads of trust and suspicion that threatened to tear her family apart. The hospital staff treated her with cautious politeness, their expressions betraying unease as they tiptoed around the subject. But for Emily, there was no escaping it. Every glance, every whispered conversation among nurses outside her door felt like a judgment, a silent accusation that someone close to her might be responsible. Daniel returned to the hospital later that day, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a hopeful smile. He seemed determined to lift Emily's spirits, but she barely acknowledged his presence. Her eyes darted between him and the floor, avoiding direct contact. She couldn't look at him without thinking about the sedative. Had he known? Was he involved? "Hey," Daniel said softly, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "How are you feeling today?" Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she focused on smoothing the blanket over her legs, her fingers trembling slightly. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "They found something in my blood," she said, cutting straight to the point. "A sedative." Daniel froze, his hand hovering mid-air as he reached for the water pitcher. For a split second, his face betrayed pure shock, wide eyes, parted, lips, but then he composed himself, forcing a neutral expression. "What kind of sedative?" he asked, his tone carefully controlled. "One used in surgeries," Emily replied, watching him closely. "It can make people unconscious for hours, days even." Daniel nodded slowly, sitting down in the chair beside her bed. "That explains why you were unresponsive," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "But how did it get into your system?" "That's what I want to know," Emily shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Who gave it to me? And why?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Daniel flinched visibly, his jaw tightening. "You think I did this?" he asked, his voice strained. "You think I would hurt you?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Emily admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "I trusted you, Daniel. I trusted everyone. But now, I don't know who to believe." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His shoulders sagged under the weight of her doubts. "Emily, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. If someone drugged you, it wasn't me." "But you were with me the whole time," Emily countered, her voice breaking. "You were the one making decisions when I was sick. You were the one who told them to stop treatment when they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Don't you see how suspicious that looks?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Frustration etched across his face. "Of course I see it," he snapped, his composure slipping. "But I didn't poison you, Emily. Why would I do that? We're married. I love you." The word love echoed hollowly in the room, landing like a stone in still water. Emily stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Did she believe him? Could she afford to? The uncertainty gnawed at her, leaving her stomach churned and her mind racing. Laura arrived later that evening, her presence adding fuel to the growing tension. She swept into the room like a storm cloud, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Have you talked to him yet?" she demanded, jerking her head toward Daniel, who stood awkwardly near the window. "We talked," Emily replied quietly, glancing at her sister. But it doesn't change anything. There are too many questions. Laura snorted derisively. Questions? This isn't rocket science, Em. Someone drugged you, and Daniel had access to everything. He was the one calling the shots when you got sick. Doesn't that strike you as convenient? Stop it, Laura. Daniel interjected sharply, stepping forward. You weren't there. You have no idea what I went through. And whose fault is that? Laura shot back, her voice rising. Maybe if you'd listened to me earlier, if you'd pushed harder to find answers, we wouldn't be sitting here wondering whether my sister should have died in the first place. The argument escalated quickly, voices bouncing off the sterile walls of the hospital room. Emily sat silently in the middle of it all, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket as if it could anchor her to reality. She wanted to scream, to demand silence, but the words caught in her throat. How had things spiraled so far out of control? Eventually, a nurse intervened, reminding them sternly that this was a hospital and not a courtroom. Both Daniel and Laura backed down reluctantly, though their anger simmered just beneath the surface. Daniel excused himself, muttering something about getting coffee while Laura sank into the chair beside Emily's bed. He's hiding something, Laura insisted, her voice quieter now but no less firm. I can feel it. Emily sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. I don't know what to think anymore, she admitted. Everything feels like a lie. Laura placed a hand on Emily's arm, her expression softening. You deserve the truth, she said gently, no matter how hard it is to hear. As the days passed, the rift between Daniel and Emily widened. Conversations became stilted and forced, filled with unspoken accusations and lingering doubts. Daniel tried to stay by her side, bringing books and updates from home, but Emily kept him at arm's length. She needed space, not just from him, but from everyone. The only person she trusted completely was herself, and even that trust felt fragile. Meanwhile, investigators began looking into the case, prompted by both the hospital's findings and public pressure. Detectives interviewed doctors, nurses, and family members, piecing together timelines and motives. They questioned Daniel extensively, probing into his actions during Emily's illness and his financial situation. Debt collectors had been hounding him for months, they discovered, and his insurance policy listed a substantial payout in the event of Emily's death. When confronted with this information, Daniel broke down. Sitting in a cold interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly together, he confessed, not to poisoning Emily, but to considering drastic measures. I thought about faking her death, he admitted, his voice trembling. Just for the money. I never intended to hurt her, I swear, but I was desperate. Desperation wasn't an excuse, but it shed light on his behavior. Investigators shared the details of his confession with Emily, careful not to overwhelm her already fragile state. Hearing it confirmed her worst fears. Daniel had entertained the idea of staging her death, even if he hadn't gone through with it. That knowledge shattered whatever remnants of trust remained between them. In the aftermath of the confession, Emily made a decision. As soon as she was discharged from the hospital, she filed for divorce. It wasn't an easy choice. Years of love and memories weighed heavily on her heart. But she knew she couldn't rebuild her life with someone she no longer trusted. Daniel accepted the decision quietly, retreating into himself as guilt consumed him. For Emily, moving forward meant starting over. She rented a small apartment near the hospital, where she continued therapy sessions to process the trauma of her experience. Friends and neighbors rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Slowly, she began to reclaim pieces of her old self, the teacher who cared deeply about others, the woman who refused to let fear dictate her life. Yet the scars remained, invisible but ever present. Every night she checked the locks on her doors multiple times before going to bed. Every sound startled her, triggering flashbacks to the coffin. And every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back, a survivor of something unimaginable. Despite the pain, Emily vowed to turn her ordeal into something meaningful. She began speaking publicly about her experience, advocating for stricter protocols to prevent cases of pseudo-death and raising awareness about medical errors. Her story resonated with countless others who had faced similar tragedies, giving her a renewed sense of purpose. As she stood behind a podium at a community center months later, addressing a room full of attentive listeners, Emily realized she had come a long way since waking up in that coffin. She wasn't the same person she had been before. It was impossible to erase the trauma, but she was stronger, wiser, determined to live fully without letting fear hold her back. And somewhere deep inside, she allowed herself to hope again.